Okay, so hello everybody. Good morning or good night or good afternoon, depending on where are you connecting from. I'm Dr. Maria Teresa Garrido. I'm the coordinator of the doctoral program, and I'm very glad to introduce you for the fourth webinar of this series. We have Natacha John and Nicole McVeigh. Nicole will be the moderator of this webinar. So Nicole, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Maria Teresa. Yes, my name is Nicole McVeigh, and I will be the moderator today. I am currently a PhD student here at University for Peace. And a couple of housekeeping issues before I introduce our presenter today. If you can keep your microphone muted so that we can best hear our presenter. We will also have an opportunity for questions, but as you listen to the presenter, if you have questions, you may put them in the chat, and that way I will be able to see them and address them in the order in which they are received. Those are my housekeeping questions. And I would like to introduce today's presenter for the fourth webinar series on our doctorate program. Her name is Natacha John, and she is currently based in Jordan. And her research is based on her time spent in Syria with the UNHCR. And her title of her webinar is going to be Humanitarian Aid and HHRR Monitoring During Complex Emergencies. So without further ado, I am going to switch the floor over to Natacha. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you, Maria Teresa, as well. And thanks all for showing interest in this topic that is obviously something I'm passionate about, so I'm happy to share. And say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's evening here in Jordan. I would like to first perhaps share my screen because I have a presentation. If that works, we'll find out. The topic is called Humanitarian Workers, and it's about exploring the parameters within which humanitarians can be expected to monitor human rights through lens of the Syrian crisis. That's the topic of the thesis, the whole thesis. But today I propose to focus on duty and exploring duty. Because before you can go into the what's and the whys and the hows, we need to establish if there is a kind of general duty. And to take a step back from that, whilst working in Syria on various functions, including protection and reporting, and working from Damascus largely, although traveling around between 2011 and 2014, end of 2014, it became clear that there was no clear framework for humanitarians working in complex emergencies like Syria. So complex emergency has a specific definition, and usually there's kind of a declaration that something has reached a certain level of complexity, and then clusters are activated. So the UN system turns into something slightly different when it reaches a certain level of complexity. And it seemed that on the ground, whilst many actors were denied entry into the country, human rights, for example, but also there was an intermittent presence of peacekeepers that then had to leave, and then we all started to see our countries, ambassadors, and the whole country setup of the various Western countries leave, and visas were started to be revoked of predominantly Western staff, but not me for some reason. Perhaps I don't look very Western, which is positive here. But so we found ourselves quite alone as the humanitarian UN, and with a lot of pressures to ask people asking questions about the human rights situation inside the country. And there was a lack of framework or structure that allowed proper reporting and understanding of also the constraints that one might face and understanding of the risks that one might face. And so that's generally what this PhD is about. It's an exploration of that. How far should we go? How far can we go? And if we were to go, you know, what kind of things could we put in place that would make it a more logical, less risky affair? So with that, I'm going to keep trying to share this PowerPoint. Sorry, technology is clearly not my strong point. So yeah, apologies for the delay and technical hiccup. But again, I think I've broadly explained the interest and purpose around doing this thesis. But just to focus a little bit on duty, which is one chapter of the proposed thesis. And so the normative backdrop around that is really based on what we call the fiduciary principle. So there's a number of individuals who've written about international organizations having a relationship, their relationship with the people that they serve. And one way that that's been described is as a fiduciary relationship. And I found this principle very apt and useful, and I chose to adopt it as the normative backdrop of this thesis. And also because it establishes, thank you for sharing, it establishes a minimum standard. And that minimum standard is, you know, if it costs you nothing to help, then of course you should help. So that's one thing. Great. If we could move on to the second slide, that would be fantastic. Thank you. And can I think, do I have control as well? No. Okay. So yeah, so in this slide, you see this picture of a drowning child. And this is taken from the philosopher Peter Singer. And Peter Singer, he comes up with a context in which a child is drowning, and what do we do? Are we obligated to go and help? If the pond is shallow and it's of no risk to us, for sure we are, and most people would say yes. But then would you help if others were able or closer to the child? Would you help, or would you just expect them to? And at what cost? So that's one framework. So we have the fiduciary framework, we have the drowning child framework, and then also we have, I chose to look at the framework around medical work. So I mean, in short, the Hippocratic Oath, but also because most of our humanitarians on the ground are often doctors and health workers. And so it's very interesting to see, you know, the framework within which they work, and often if they can work, they will. If they can help, they will help. They have an obligation, doctors usually, to do good, to not do harm, as do we. Okay, thanks. Oops. Okay. I'm sorry, I've got control. They have an obligation not to do harm, as do we. They have an obligation to help within the scope of one's practice, which is also quite interesting because as a humanitarian, you know, and it kind of is on the crux of you shouldn't do harm as well, but you also operate within your area of expertise. I don't get involved in things I don't know anything about. And I found that also interesting. And then the final framework of the four, as you can see, is around humanitarian principles. And these are well known. There are four main humanitarian principles, and that's humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But also, I mean, we have during the thread of our work this obligation not to do harm. So you can see quite a lot of crossover between these four frameworks. But as I put them together and applied them to the situation of human rights monitoring, I came up with four central questions that will guide this work. And one was, secondly, was to what extent does expertise influence the duty to monitor or help? So if you're uniquely qualified in this area, should you then act? What extra duties come with proximity? If you're the only ones who can see what's going on, what extra duties do you have? And then finally, how does what control influence? And here I'll look at the issues of state sovereignty and where international organizations such as the Humanitarian UN can gain more firm control and what obligations that brings about. So those are the four questions that I would like to look at. Oh gosh, why do I keep doing that? Okay. So just moving on from, is there a way to, yes. Okay, so moving on from that, the first key question is on humanity. So those are the four research questions. And on humanity, clearly to do our work as humanitarians, we need to plan it. We need to know who the beneficiaries are going to be, and the basis in which we plan is it can be controversial. Historically, we always looked at needs-based work. There's a discussion and discussion that's slightly outside of the scope of this whole thesis is needs-based and rights-based work. But what we do know is that the nature of crises have changed and they're increasingly protracted, and Syria is just a perfect example of this. It continues to this day. So having started in 2011, and there's no sign that it will end anytime soon. And as crises have now been protracted, the way you assess needs to consider the protracted nature of the crisis. There's been what I would call a mergering of development and humanitarian work. And certainly many of the actors on the ground do both. And there are increased talks in the world of policy in the development and humanitarian development peace nexus, otherwise known as the triple nexus. And all of those things have made huge changes in the way that we do work and the way that we assess who needs help. And that assessment now cannot be done without identifying the rights issues on the ground. So I would argue that even in the initial stage, in the initial planning stage, humanitarians need to know something about the rights on the ground. This is even more the case with protection programming. So protection is about the realization of rights of people, beneficiaries. And so in order to do protection programming specifically, you cannot realize rights if you don't know which rights need the most help or work or how to prioritize them. And then finally, and in protection programming, specifically how that translates on the ground is, you could have a child protection program, you could have a detention program, you could have missing persons program, and all of these things you need to establish what comes first, where will you put most of your money and your time, depending on what the needs are on the ground. And the needs are clearly rights ones. And so then finally, the other thing that is of concern to UNHCR mainly is the issue of refugee status determination, but it affects most humanitarian situations where refugees are formed, mainly because you cannot really establish that someone is a refugee without understanding some of the rights issues in the country that that refugee has fled from. And so if you happen to be also in the country where refugees are fleeing from and working for the same organization, you would have first-hand information that would contribute to better information that could inform that refugee status determination. So that's a final way in which it's important for planning purposes. And for response purposes, just establishing how to respond and responding properly. And I think that I would say that first heading is not that controversial. But what is controversial are the last 2 points, which is the responsibility to protect, early warning. So not much has been written about, whether humanitarians really should be involved or how, or to what extent they can get involved in this kind of responsibility to protect. Mantra responsibility to protect is largely referenced in respect to use of force and military action to resolve a situation, but it's a framework that encompasses many things. And as I sat in Syria in the first years of the crisis, the Sri Lanka report came out of the activities in Sri Lanka, and it was quite clear that many of the things that apply to Sri Lanka could also apply to Syria. And there, the humanitarian UN was berated for not properly reporting early and on time. And this whole framework comes from what happened in Rwanda, and we all said never again. But what hasn't been worked on is if the human rights people are not allowed in, the Human Rights UN, if the peacekeepers are not allowed in, and only humanitarians remain, to what extent really can this kind of early warning activity happen? And for those of you who will read my thesis when it's eventually done, later chapters will deal with things like how reporting should be done and which rights should be reported on. But here, one has to be sure that many rights will be protected, and how far does one go to protect the rights of many over the rights of one? And if you're risking your very presence in the country, you also risk leaving all these people all alone. So there's many, many things that need to be taken into account, and that will be elaborated later on. But when we're just considering duty, yes, there is a duty here to ensure that proper early warning is done. How it's done is more the issue. Even more controversial is the issue of advocacy and condemnation. I mean, you won't see an internal debate within the United Nations about this because we don't tend to debate between each other, but you'd see that in the public domain, an elaboration of this debate can be found between MSF and ICRC. Because MSF say they speak out, ICRC say they don't, and the reasons for that. But what I would put to the table here is that whilst the advocacy is good, there's not a very clear, what we call in humanitarian work, theory of change. So there's no clear link between good advocacy, defending the rights of others, and then specifically positive impacts on the ground. That link has yet to be established in these kinds of situations. So we could all go out and express outrage at this armed group or this government, but what effect would that have on the ground for the people that need it the most? This is the question. So that would be, but in general, and conclude under humanity, for sure, we need to be monitoring human rights because we do that anyway, and we need it to do our work and to understand what's going on. So the second heading is expertise. And under expertise, I've just put the Interagency Sectoral Committee, which covers all this humanitarian work we do, and the graphic that shows how we divide the work, and who's responsible for each sector or cluster, as we sometimes call them, or working group. But broadly, we're organized in these areas. And here again, of course, one that's most relevant when it comes to human rights monitoring is always going to be protection, therefore led by UNHCR, but it's not alone. I mean, even if you're WFP and you're doing food assistance, I mean, the progressive right and the right to food is one of those things that you would have to look at, and WFP do indeed look at that. So that's just broadly how we're organized. I would say we have an expertise. I would say that broadly, if you work in the area of, for example, UNICEF, you work in the area of, child nutrition, then probably you're best placed to report on the situation there. So I think the expertise is important. And that people probably it would not be good to report outside of your area or to monitor outside of your area of expertise, unless something is, I mean, there's some basic rights that are probably so obvious to everyone, but it's the method of monitoring is always something that one needs to learn. So yeah, in terms of expertise as well, it's good to know that there are human rights components in virtually all of the mandates of the funds and programs that form part of the Humanitarian UN. UNICEF has incorporated the Convention on the Rights of the Child in their mandate. These are just some examples. UNDP are required to promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. UNHCR, it's always a big one because it really is a lead on protection. And they've also recognized the direct causal link between the causes of mass human rights violations and consequent forced displacement. And again, that speaks to the planning, but also because they have recognized this, they really do have expertise here. And then also assures refugees the widest possible exercise of fundamental rights and freedom. So that's part of the mandate, or how they see their mandate now. And these mandates actually are always changing, but there's no agency that does not talk in terms of rights anymore. So what are we on to now? Proximity. And I guess I lead this with, we were there. This picture is a picture of actually a Palestine refugee camp, and I now work for UNRWA, so I see this picture all the time because it's amazing that we got in, and it's amazing that we took this picture, because even if you're inside a country, it doesn't mean you're always there where the issues are happening, and so often there were deals made, and just see what, sorry. Yeah, and so as I've said before, as the UN in Syria, we were one of the last people to be able to access government-controlled areas. At least when I left the country. I mean, I'm not keeping track now. I think it's opened up considerably, but there were other aspects that I think one should consider when considering presence. Oops, gone too far. My computer's so slow. No, sorry, skips to the end. Yeah, proximity. So yeah, as I mentioned, we were the last there, so we're proximate, and then what duties come with that. But then also the access issues in Syria are well known and well recorded. There are Security Council resolutions on access, and the UN in Syria has to do regular reporting to the UN headquarters in New York, and those reports are a matter of public record. And they will show the massive access constraints, and they will talk about the besieged areas surrounded by some parties side to the conflict. And sometimes, occasionally, access was gained into those areas, and often there was no access. And I guess the first thing I would like to speak about regarding that is one, so we as the Humanitarian UN are often on the ground, but often we usually, I'd say, work through partnerships. And so partnerships with local actors who are much more proximate than we are, and that's one thing to take into account. So is it the international UN staff member that's witnessing a lot of these atrocities, or is it a national person? And how much can we really say that there is a duty there? And I think that some of these things, even though one could say maybe there's a duty, one could say also it's probably not possible for risk of life and all this stuff. So, but it's important to be aware that whilst the UN, humanitarian UN, is often in places, they often always, employ local organisations as partners to do much of the real work. And then thirdly, there's the issue of aiding, abetting, and abetting. So I'm offering, as a former lawyer, I'm offering a slightly different way of looking at this. But in the framework of international criminal law, sometimes just being there and observing and seeing something happen that's plainly illegal and unlawful amounts to aiding and abetting. And when you see something that's incredibly unlawful, like genocide, I'm not saying that's what's happening or happened, but like genocide or a crime against humanity or whatever, when you see those things, to what extent can you be found to be aiding and abetting? So that's that. And then finally, I just wanted to refer to these agreements that were made going into besieged areas and the OPCW entry, because that was quite unique. But so often many agreements were made to go into besieged areas. So if you think you're alone in the country of Syria, for example, you're definitely alone when you go into a besieged area to help the people there. And you have to be careful, because we have this do no harm, to not do harm to anyone in there and to not allow harm to come to them. So when the agreement is made that you go in and help, it's important that information is not then extracted that puts people at risk. And so that is a tough one when agreements can be very tight and closely controlled. So I'd say perhaps there's a duty to monitor and talk about what's going on inside a besieged area, but with the knowledge that most of what you do and monitor will likely fall into the hands of parties to the conflict. I think one has to be quite careful. Even more specific, I'll use the example of OPCW, who, when I was in Syria, there was a great standoff, and we thought that responsibility to protect might get activated. Certainly, there was indication that there were chemical weapons, and on the political side, there were many discussions about how to get OPCW in to check for chemical weapons. And initially, of course, permission was refused. But a negotiation was reached between the unlikely allies of Russia and the US and Syria all around the table. And an agreement was reached to go into a specific area to check for chemical weapons. But I guess from a humanitarian perspective, what was often untold was that these UN staff went in to check for chemical weapons, but it's not really clear that any checking was done for human rights related issues or monitoring. And I wouldn't say that that is the greatest issue either at that time. I mean, I think the greatest issue was that no one had entered that area with, apologies for the noise. Neighbor's dog, I can do nothing about it. But okay. but I think the worst thing that probably happened was that OPCW entered an area without food that had not been served with food for some time, you know. So, I mean, so there's gradations as to what is important and what is not in a crisis. And I don't think human rights monitoring is the most important always, but certainly, you know, when agreements are made of that nature, it would be useful to include certain basic things like food and kind of human rights monitoring that could be referenced as needs assessment, which would probably go down better. So, so my suggestions there, that's how that could have been done differently. But finally, I guess the issue is control. So of course, on human rights, host state, national states have primary responsibility to uphold human rights within the countries that they rule. And secondary responsibility, I argue, goes with the international organizations. Now, if a host state is fulfilling their responsibility, then there is very little need for an international organization to enter and attempt to help. Where they're not fulfilling it or not able to fulfill, unable, unwilling, it's often because there has been an element of control that has been lost. And so sometimes, and I think the interesting case of camp management, you can really see that although we as the UN don't want to ever say that we have any kind of government status in any country, as we respect sovereignty, that's a principle. The issue of camp management is problematic. And it is problematic because if host states are not exercising governmental control and assistance is being delivered as if it were government, then one could argue, where is the effective control? And then because of that, one could argue that there are heightened responsibilities towards host state governments. And then finally, on the case management side, so that's another way of control, is my argument. And often protection actors do a lot of case management. Like, so for example, in a social services type situation in child protection, you know, if a child is missing or displaced from their parents, you know, there would be a certain amount of checks and balances done to try and locate the child's parents, ensure that those parents are indeed the child's parents and nothing else, ensure that a reunification will be in their best interests. And so a lot of interviews are done with the child and people around the child, but you can see how a lot of control is being exercised. And I argue in those cases, there's a heightened duty to uphold human rights, and so monitoring and understanding how well you're doing versus the human rights framework is incredibly important. So those are the aspects and the headings, and you know, I probably don't need to say this, but I will say this, that nothing I say reflects any of the United Nations organizations I've worked for. They are my own opinions. But to conclude, I say that there is a duty of the Humanitarian UN to monitor human rights. And that duty is because of our duty towards humanity, our special expertise, our proximity to the event, and sometimes our extra control that we have over the beings that we're trying to help. And so for all those reasons, I'd say we've got duty, but there are a number of things to be worked out in terms of how that happens and what rights should be monitored. And if anyone does read my thesis, there's a section at the end on accountability and what mechanisms are in place to hold the UN to account. So that's a little bit the structure, and that's just chapter 5 of my thesis. I'm open to questions.
Can I ask a question, or Nicole is maybe moderating it?
Sorry about that. Natasha had controlled the screen and I couldn't get myself to unmute. Hold on. Okay. First, thank you very much, Natasha, for your insightful and very interesting research. And yes, and we can now open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, there are a couple of different options. You could write your question in the chat if your audio is not working very well. You could also use the raise hand feature and I will see you. Or you can do what Mickey's doing and just kind of wave her hand with video and I'll see that as well. So Mickey, if you would like to ask your question.
Natasha, thank you so much for your presentation and congratulations on your thesis. I think, sorry, I missed the first part of your introduction. So I just really want to know, I think you're done already and you're going to do the defense of your dissertation. I just want to know the stages of where you are now. At the same time, also, I really admire you've been working professionally full-time and managing this process, but it's not easy to do it. And I just want to know if I may ask, if we can really also respond, is how many years you took and then any issues you encountered, how you resolve it until really reaching to this stage. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nikki. Not a question I was expecting, but thank you. Yeah, I'm actually, yeah, I have to resubmit my thesis on the 1st of November is the deadline. So yes, I have submitted it in the past, and it came back with a number of comments, which I've been working on. And I've been in this since leaving Syria at the end of 2014, so 6 years. But in those 6 years, I've had a considerable delay, mainly because I've had to work at the same time. I also managed to have 3 children whilst doing that. And so it's been really, really tough. So the day this is submitted and cleared, I will celebrate. But it was very, very tough. It feels never ending. But the beauty of always being in the work is that it's kind of knowledge that I need anyway for my own work, especially sitting in the headquarters of an agency covering the Palestinian issue. So it's really been another reason to be kept up to date with things. And certainly everything I've learned here I use. So it's not been lost, but I really do hope that it reaches the standard to be defended. But yeah, I joined at the beginning of the process when I mean, Maria Teresa probably can tell you more, because I joined when she was also in her first year, and I spent the first year in Costa Rica. And then after that, I had to leave because financially just couldn't manage it, and went back to kind of work and doing this part-time. So that's a little bit about the process.
Thank you, but congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey, for your question, and thank you for your answer, Natasha. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Please feel free. Okay, Pratush, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yes. Thank you, Natasha, for this presentation, and good to have a presentation from someone who is at the fag end of completing the thesis. I just had one question. I mean, in your presentation, you talked about responsibility to protect, but there are like other concepts as well when it comes to this, like responsibility while protecting. Did you look at those things, or that is not in the scope of your research? I would just like to know that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I didn't look at responsibility while protecting in terms of, I mean, I look, the word protection is used a lot in different ways. So I have looked at all policy documents relating to protection and humanitarian protection. But in terms of the witnessing side, as in witnessing, report to witness, and the early warning, that stuff I've looked at, but on a very kind of peripheral level. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you're referring to the humanitarian policy documents on what we do while we do humanitarian work, or if it's more kind of early warning.
No, I meant like responsibility to protect. It gives us an impression that it is something that when you are going into the humanitarian aspects of things, but responsibility while protecting is more operational in nature, and the things that you do on ground, that has differences in terms of when you talk about responsibility to protect. I mean, it's a Brazilian concept of responsibility while protecting. And of course, the UN came up with responsibility to protect. So I just wanted to know that has responsibility while protecting, has it been somehow mainstream in the UN system, or is it still a very peripheral idea when it comes to humanitarian aspects of things?
No, I don't think it's it doesn't. I mean, from the wording that you use, it doesn't sound paraphernalia at all. It sounds central, as in, you know, protection and mainstreaming of protection is a word that every humanitarian UN agency uses all the time and doesn't always effectively implement. But it's certainly there, and the policy documents are there. I still think more work can be done on really translating it practically to every aspect, but every aspect of the work that we do, from logistics to food assistance, must consider the mainstreaming angle, which is the protection. So that is there, but I'm not familiar with the Brazilian example, but I will look it up. I'm very firmly fixed in the Middle East, so it's, but I'll have a look at the Brazilian example.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
and
you.
It's nice to hear the azan from the background. So,
Yeah.
so it's nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Pertush, and thank you, Natasha. I see that Maria Teresa, do you have your hand raised?
Yes, I do have my hand raised because I have a question.
Okay.
As you know, in Venezuela, this idea of a complex humanitarian emergency has been kind of raised up by NGOs to deal with all of the situation, people starving and diseases and all of the things. So I was wondering more about the conceptual framework you use in terms of defining complex emergencies, because you are using the idea of Syria, but we tend to believe that complex emergency are in cases of like devastation, full armed conflict, and Venezuelans are trying to use that same concept to apply it to Venezuela. So I was wondering more in the conceptual level of the complex emergency, how do you reflect on that concept, and how do you perceive the idea of complex emergency?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, actually, on complex emergency, there is a specific definition, but actually, when the UN decides something is complex, like a level 3 emergency, we call it, there's a lot of political bartering in the background, and then a decision is made that it's somehow complex, and then we activate various parts of the UN that become a little bit better funded and supports us a little bit better. So the definition, there is one. I haven't got it to hand, but from experience, the bartering behind it is political, and sometimes it might not seem very logical that some emergencies have amounted to level 3 complex emergencies, and others haven't received the same political elevation and therefore not the same humanitarian backing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. That's very, very interesting about just the language that's probably used to define what a complex emergency is and how it can be interpreted in different situations, and who gets the funding or the humanitarian aid that's needed. So that's very interesting. I see that Ahmed has raised his hand. Would you like to comment or make a question, Ahmed?
Before, I would like just to ask you one question. When you were doing this research, did you select a specific country as a case study, or you have made from different countries?
Yeah, no, Ahmed, I
Thank you.
selected. Thank you. Thanks so much for the question. I selected Syria as the country for the case study because I had been in Syria for the first 3.5 years of that crisis. So actually, that's that case. So my methodology has a case study element. So I mean, my methodology is many things. So it's a kind of like a legal doctoral review, and then at the end there's a bit of a case study, and the case study is using Syria.
Thank you very much. Really, your presentation made us as if we are in the humanitarian field.
Oh, good. So I'm happy for that. Take
Thank
good
you
care,
once again.
Okay, take good care.
Nikki, did you have another question? I see your finger up.
If other people not really having, because this is my second round. If anybody, no, it's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Again, so some like a methodology question, Natasha, because you've been working for the organization, the UN organization, and then you've been working for the specific country. It's 3.5 years. So you have a very intimate knowledge and experiences. So how and also you've been reading a document as a basically UN and other policy document. And I'm sorry, because I'm also having a very similar situation, and then we tend to speak based on our assumptions, not necessarily, not necessarily reviewing thoroughly about the work done by others, particularly scholars, and then don't really think that theory is very important. But how I really can try to really be away from your little bit of your professional perspective and then experience, but to try to be also so scientific or more academic approach to your subject, and then put it in your dissertation. Like your conceptual framework is very clear, the 4 pillars, and I just want to know how you did it.
Thanks, Vicky. That's just an amazing question, because actually it was this issue that I really struggled with, actually. And well, one, as someone who has been a lawyer, as someone who actually works in this environment all the time, I really just didn't understand what I had to do with regards to methodology. I just need to read and research, but what's this methodology stuff initially? And I did some reading and I got it wrong, and I think that this was a huge part of the initial feedback, and I hope it's better now. It's very interesting. I mean, like when I'm just, as we were speaking, I'm trying to like look at my methods chapter, but as it's been rewritten, or actually written, maybe one could argue it wasn't properly written beforehand. But I'm looking at this from multiple perspectives. Initially, I said, okay, well, I was in Syria, so maybe I'm doing, I don't know. I have a husband who has already got a doctorate degree, but in anthropology, and he convinced me I was doing empirical research, which so I kept on looking up the word empirical and trying to understand what that was. But I've also since been convinced that I'm not doing empirical research. So what I can say is it's clearly qualitative and not quantitative. I can say that I'm relying heavily on policy analysis. So I have, and I think that I'm in a unique position, and I've looked up a lot of information around policy analysis as a methodology, and it's clear that I'm in a unique position to understand the policy, as I was often there when it was being drafted, and I know exactly where it is. And even though lots of information is often in the public domain, often if you're not there and you don't know where to find it or how to find it or how to systematically go about it. So that was one of the heads. And then then there's this whole kind of legal side of things, and what your approach is to law and how you apply it. And that's been really painful, because each time I talk about my legal methodology, I have to go back to each chapter and see, like, how did I actually apply the law here, and then look at the methodology again. And then finally, there's the case study, which is, comes with its limitations. And I always said, like with case studies, it's, in law, we have something like, specific, these kinds of big cases sometimes make bad law, because it's a unique case. And so if you use this unique case, it's not good to make general assumptions from. And so that's a big limitation of using Syria as a case study. But being so immersed, I can see the, and this is what I argue, that I can see the practical repercussions of certain decisions in policy, of certain interpretations. And so, and I can refer to practical examples of things that happen on the ground. And I think that enriches the thesis. So that was the kind of journey that I've been on. And it took a lot of help and a lot of consultation with people that are much more academic than I. And I don't know if it will pass, but it's been substantially redrafted, because that was a key area of weakness. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you very much for that very honest answer, because I think the people who are here are all at different stages, and it's always nice to hear something about the practical sides of going on your doctoral journey. I do see we are actually at 11:02 right now, and I do understand that there are places that people need to go, or other virtual meetings that people need to attend. So if there are not any other questions or comments, I'd like to thank Natacha for taking her time and presenting on her research and presenting her views and her journey with us. So thank you very much, Natacha.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.